Hello and welcome to the next installment of Miss Nicola's videos on nervous system. So we have yet to talk about the brain and the spinal cord in great detail, so that is our next step. We're first going to talk about the spinal cord and how the central nervous system in general is protecting. There's a lot to say about that. And then really we'll get into the brain in part 2 video, because we have a lot to say about that. Alright, so first, a little bit of a review. Remember we talked about the nervous system, and we talked about the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. And peripheral nervous system was all the neurons outside of the spinal cord. And central nervous system consisted of neurons inside the brain and spinal cord only. So we're going to focus definitely on the central nervous system. The peripheral nervous system, it's pretty basic, doesn't change too much. You basically either have sensory neurons or motor neurons. But the central nervous system is very unique, very special. So here we have that basic picture that I showed you before of where the spinal cord comes out. And it's basically out of the base of the brain. There is a small hole in the skeleton, a small hole in the skull, excuse me, where the brainstem extends down, and the spinal cord extends from the brainstem. You can see here in the back, this is the cerebellum. And you can see on top here, this is the cortex. You can see that there looks like there's a split down the middle, and these two sides of the brain are split. They are connected together by something called the corpus callosum. We'll talk more about that when we get to the brain. So there are lobes, so to speak. Cerebellum is different from the cortex. This deals with muscular coordination, things like that. So all of this information that is going to and from the body all have to go down through the spinal cord. There's a few exceptions to that with what we call the cranial nerves. But besides the cranial nerves, pretty much the information going up and down to the body is going through the spinal cord. So sensory information is going to be going in this direction, from basically to the brain. And motor and gland information, or information flowing through these neurons, can be going down the other direction. And then from the spinal cord, it's going to go up to from the peripheral nerves. So the skull and the vertebrae are the first layer of protection. And you can see here you have the spinal cord going down through the middle of this vertebrae. And you can see spinal nerves coming out through the side. So if you have pairs of these nerves, you have one going out this way, one going out the other way. So if you remember, this is not showing you all of the connective tissue, all of the, the tendons, and the ligaments holding all this together. This is not showing you all the musculature. Remember all these different, random looking shapes, weird looking shapes. They are there for a reason. It's there for the connective tissue and muscles to attach to these bones to keep this vertebrae strong and upright and holding up the weight of the vast majority of your body. And here you can see the disc. When these discs move, remember this is fibrous cartilage or fibrocartilage. If these move and they press on one of these sensory nerves in this area, you're going to get some weird things going on. You're going to get cut off sensation, you're going to get numbness, you may get pain. A lot of different things can happen depending on which spinal nerve it's touching and where it's touching it, how much it's touching it. So that first level of protection is the skull and vertebrae. The second level is something called the meninges, or meninges is the way I remember it. But these are 3 layers of specialized connective tissue surrounding the brain and spinal cord, and they help to anchor the brain and spinal cord. The brain is, though, it is just kind of floating there. Floating meaning that there is something called cerebrospinal fluid surrounding the brain. And these connective tissues, they do anchor the brain in some spots, but primarily when you move your head, your brain is moving a little bit also. So it kind of makes sense when somebody gets in a car accident or they're playing football or a sport and they are running, moving very fast, and then they hit their head. The brain inside is still going the same speed that you were before, even though your skull has stopped. So part of what a concussion is damage to this connective tissue, and it's also damage to the cells in the meningia. And if you damage it really badly, you can actually damage some of the cells of the actual cortex itself. And depending on how bad you damage it, some of them can repair themselves. There's more cells there than just neurons. There's a bunch of other helper cells, so to speak. So they'll be damaged too, and then you can get bleeding in those areas. So it's still pretty sensitive when it comes to acceleration and de-acceleration damage. So inside this Meninja, you have, I'm not going to list and talk about the different layers. One of them is Duramater, so Impeomater, so that, look at that a little bit more when we look at the pictures, but I left those off of your test. We just need to know that Meninja's, its layers of connective tissue. It's a place for blood vessels to go into the brain, and it's also a place to provide shock absorption. So when the brain is floating in the cerebrospinal fluid, its weight is much less than if it was just sitting there. It's like right about 3 pounds. And I forget what it says in your book, how much it weighs, but when sitting in fluid, it really only weighs a few ounces. So it doesn't move around as much inside this fluid in and of itself. And fluid is not compressible also. You can't compress fluids. So that is also helpful in providing shock absorption. So this cerebrospinal fluid, it's a watery broth of gases, nutrients, chemical messengers, and waste products. They are made by cells that are ciliated. Ependymal cells is what they're called. So they not only create this fluid, but they circulate this fluid through what we call ventricles. Ventricles are openings. We have ventricles in the heart where blood flows through. So it's just another word for like open chamber. So we have open chambers inside of our brain with this fluid inside of it. We have this fluid surrounding our brain, and this fluid is continuous all throughout the central nervous system, meaning that it goes down the central canal of the spinal cord. So this fluid is constantly circulating and moving. It's constantly being made, it's constantly being lost. So the reason why it is moving, it is to move these materials around, these gases, nutrients, and waste products. And also, very importantly, chemical messengers in the form of neurotransmitters. You have certain areas of the central nervous system that will make neurotransmitters that are needed somewhere else in the central nervous system. You may have a portion, for example, a part of the brain inside the cortex that makes dopamine. Dopamine will be released into the cerebrospinal fluid, where it will flow down to the bottom of the spinal cord, where cells there may use it for a particular purpose. So these materials are circulating around. So here's some pictures of the layers just above the brain. So you have the cortex here, or what we call the cerebral cortex. That's the crinkly part of the brain. And you have these undulations in the brain called sulci and gyri. So connected directly to that brain, attached to the pia mater. Okay, and then you have the arachnoid mater. Arachnoid referring to, it looks like a spider. So it was called that because it looks like a spider web. You can see there's a lot of connective tissue in here. And we have the duramater, and you have a couple different ones. One of them attaches directly to the skull and represents the periosteum of the bone. If you remember, the periosteum of the bone is where we have blood vessels. So you have blood vessels moving through here. They're not showing them on here. Then you have the skull and the scalp. And in between all of these empty spaces, well, not all of them, the periosteal duramater is attached to the skull. But in between where the meningeal duramater and where the arachnoid mater is filled with cerebral spinal fluid. So it fills in all of these cavities and all these open areas. So the brain down here, we have an anchor point, but it's also sitting in this fluid, so it can move on its own. Here's a picture where the cerebral spinal fluid is. You can see the blue, and you can see it infiltrates some of the sulci and gyri of the brain. And you can see there's some in the ventricles. Some around the pituitary gland, then goes down the spinal cord, around the cerebellum over here. You can see a better picture. Not really better picture, but a little more blue. See where the cerebral spinal fluid is? Goes down to the spinal cord. Here's a picture of the ventricles. So these are literally like holes in our brains. The biggest ones are called the lateral ventricle, but you have one called the third ventricle, fourth ventricle, cerebral aqueduct. And where they get the third and fourth, I'm guessing, they named these 1 and 2. So we got 1, 2, and then they ran out of cool names, so they called it third and fourth ventricles, and then you have the central canal. So cerebrospinal fluid is flowing. So there are ciliated cells, very similar to what is in your trachea, inside your lungs, inside your sinuses that we talked about, that are moving, instead of moving, dust particles, this is moving a watery fluid. And there's another cool picture. Somebody has colored in, it looks like a real leg. I don't know, some kind of scan. Looks like somebody has colored in. You can see the cerebrospinal fluid will infiltrate into what they call the sulci, which is the depressions of the different lobes of the cerebral cortex. And you can see lateral ventricles here. And you can see we do have a big slit down the middle of it. This is the corpus callosum right here that connects the two. So you can see the fluid goes down into here. So this is a way of materials moving around, and you can see they can very easily get to different parts of the brain. So you've heard of a spinal tap before. So you can take cerebrospinal fluid out of the lower lumbar region of the vertebrae, and you can analyze it for a number of different things. And then it'll tell you what's going on inside the brain. It'll tell you if there's any infection. You ever heard of meningitis? That's from infection and inflammation of the meninges in the central nervous system. There's some pretty serious diseases out there. They're relatively rare. Sometimes they pop up in places like college dorm rooms, and sometimes people have a bad reaction to it. You can actually die from bacterial meningitis, whereas most people just probably wouldn't be affected by it. Some people, their immune systems can't handle it. But anyway, so you can get a spinal tap. You heard of those before. Where you can get an idea of what's going on inside of the central nervous system. You can also get what they call, for shorthand, epidural, when you're about to give birth to a child, or if you're going to have surgery, or if you, for whatever reason, need to have something done to the lower half of your body, and you want to block the pain going up to the brain. So you have an anesthesiologist who gets paid a lot of money because they are doing somewhat dangerous things. Not really dangerous to them because they do it all the time and they're highly trained. But if you can see here, you stick basically a small catheter, which is a tube, and you use a needle, and you basically put it right up next to the spinal cord, right in that space, and you inject drugs, numbing drugs, so to speak, and it blocks pain messages and among other messages going up to the brain. So you basically feel numb for the bottom half of your body. And you can imagine getting it right into that spot. It works pretty good, and it dulls some of the pain of childbirth. So this is obviously a pretty difficult thing to do. My wife had one of these for her first child, and she was in pretty strong discomfort, and they tried giving her one of these, and she had trouble sitting still. And one of the times it was going in, and I think she moved a little bit, and it poked her spinal cord, and she kind of explained it felt like electricity going down one of her legs. So pretty sensitive area. But she said, it did dull the pain of childbirth. Doesn't make it go away. It can't make the pressure go away, but you can make the feeling of it go away, at least in partial. But it also she said it made it harder to actually push the child out. With her second one, she didn't have it, and she had a much easier childbirth with it. So there's good things and bad things about it. That's what it actually looks like. So you see the catheter tube, and they got to use a needle to get it in there. That's some iodine, and medicine gets put into that space very slowly, of course, because there's not a lot of space in there. Weird looking. All right, so we talked about first level was the skull and vertebrae. Second was the meninges, the cerebrospinal fluid protection. Now, probably the most important one for non-impact issues is the blood-brain barrier. So it's a collection of selectively permeable capillaries. So all of your capillaries are selectively permeable. They allow materials to go in and out. These ones are extremely selective. So they feed blood to the central nervous system, but they also isolate the central nervous system from the general circulation. So they only allow essential nutrients and molecules in, and they keep waste products, toxins, and most drugs out. This means that any waste products, toxins, and the majority of drugs that are circulating around in the cardiovascular system, keeps that waste products from getting into the brain. Now, obviously, the brain has some waste products. Those waste products can be pushed out into the cardiovascular system. It's not a perfect system. It does work pretty good. Some drugs like alcohol can literally just get in there. It can squeeze right by. It's a relatively small molecule, so that can get in there fairly easily on its own. But other drugs, they hitch a ride, so to speak. They attach onto lipids, which is basically fats. Drugs like THC, that's in marijuana, the opiates, which is all the categories of morphine and heroin, that normally would not be allowed inside the brain because they're large molecules, but lipids are allowed to go into the brain, and these molecules can attach to those lipids, and they can get in there. So you can imagine that if you were designing drugs to have an effect on the neurotransmitters inside the brain, they're like antidepressants. Your first task, besides trying to make that drug, is to make sure they can get into the brain. So it's very hard for some of these drugs to get into the brain because of this blood-brain barrier. There's a lot of problems that potentially could be fixed inside the brain with drugs that might work on things like the heart that don't go into the brain. So if you want to make a drug, you got to make sure you can get it past the blood-brain barrier intact. There's a couple specialized cells. So in your brain and around your spinal cord, you have astrocytes and what they call microglia. So these are specialized cells that they're basically protective cells. They have some other functions, and they're still trying to figure out what these things do. But one of the functions that we're going to focus on with astrocytes is that they maintain this barrier. They have secretions, which basically means they make chemicals that help or attract other cells that will eventually become the blood-brain barrier that builds itself around the capillaries because of the secretions from the astrocytes. Then you have microglia, which engulf waste products and any pathogens that are able to get into the area, because obviously some bacteria and viruses are able to get in, just like they're able to get in anywhere. So these are basically similar to white blood cells in a way, but they're specialized for the central nervous system. So there's a pretty good barrier there. You kind of have to, because the central nervous system is so vital to an organism's survival. So this is something that evolved a long time ago, and if it wasn't there today, you can imagine what might be consequences to it not being there. I mean, maybe we wouldn't live a very long life because something would get us, bacteria, virus, or maybe waste products would accumulate by the time we were 30 years old instead of 80 years old. So it would definitely change the way we live today. So here's a picture of the blood-brain barrier. So this is a normal capillary blood vessel. We can have materials going in and out. Inside here, you would have these are so tiny that maybe 1 or 2 red blood cells are moving down this blood vessel. So these passages are too small for any of the cells to actually leak out. So this is more for substances like lipids and glucose and other nutrients and waste products and go in and out. So with the blood-brain barrier, you can see we have a whole set of other structures here that provide an additional barrier. And if we go to the next slide, it basically kind of blows up one of these little areas here. And you can see some of the brain cells are basically the ones that are making this barrier. You can see, if it gets blown up a little bit, this barrier on the outside, these materials just can't go in and out very easily. And definitely the red blood cells can't go out, because the spaces in between there are not big enough. If you blow it up even more, I kind of like that picture because it shows you the size of things. These spaces in between, which would be right here, in between this tissue, extremely tiny. And they don't just allow any materials in. So it's basically there's almost like a jail surrounding the central nervous system. If anything wants to get in and out, it's got to get through these tight spaces. Or it's got to go through the membrane, but it needs a little help from a carrier molecule. And you can see various carrier molecules here. You can basically ignore all this stuff up here, because I'm not going to really talk about that. The idea is that through endocytosis and exocytosis and carrier molecules, molecules need to be chauffeured in and out. So there's tight regulation of what goes in and out. So molecules that shouldn't be there, they get in there without basically the body knowing it. If this was a carrier molecule right here for a fat, and a fat attached to it, and then someone smoked marijuana, THC would get stuck onto that fat, and basically it would shuttle it across the membrane into the central nervous system and into the brain without the body knowing it. So things have to sneak inside. Pretty tight regulation there, and we need it. Okay, so let's move on to the spinal cord. So those three protections, by the way, are surrounding the entire spinal cord, and they're also surrounding, obviously, the entire brain. So the spinal cord, we got 31 pairs of spinal nerves that emerge from the spinal cord along its way down to about kidney level. It's only about 18 inches long, which is about 1.5 feet, and each pair of spinal nerves services the general area where it leaves the spinal cord. If you look inside the spinal cord, you'll see there is an H-shaped gray matter surrounding a central canal, which has cerebrospinal fluid on. I put more later on, but actually we already talked about that. You'll see that surrounding the H-shaped gray matter, you have white matter. White matter is white because it's mostly made out of fat from the myelinated neurons. It also contains some unmyelinated neurons, but there's so many myelinated neurons, the color is whiter. The gray matter is where the collection of cell bodies are in the neuron. What's that O doing there? Got to fix that slide, apparently. So it looks like this. You can kind of see the basic H shape going on there. Do I have a better picture of the H? It's kind of like right there. We'll go back to the other one. So these neurons are arranged where the cell bodies, when we looked at the motor neurons, you kind of saw like the cell body was basically the top or the head. But some neurons have their cell bodies kind of like halfway down the neuron and it's off to the side. So the electrical signals still go through it, but they're actually off to the side. So what happens is these cell bodies are all get collected toward the middle, and then the myelinated portion of the neuron stays toward the outside. So there's still a continuous wire here, but the color change is just showing us the different composition of the cell body versus the myelinated portion of the neuron, which is the axon. And you can see that you have some of the meningeal material, and you can see your cerebrospinal fluid going down the central canal here. And then you can see there's the fibrocartilage disc, and you can see the weird looking horns and facets of the different vertebrae. And you can see you have the peripheral nerves going off either side, so they come in pairs. Alright, and then you can see those will branch off. So there's a lot of nervous tissue, muscular tissue in this area. It's basically like my wife says, don't ever get back surgery, because once they get in there and they start moving everything around, you're never going to be the same again. So each spinal nerve coming out, remember we got one going to each side, has what they call a dorsal root and a ventral root. Now dorsal means back, right? Ventral means abdomen, like the dorsal fin on a shark. And you just kind of have to remember that the dorsal roots contain neurons that carry signals to the brain from various kinds of sense receptors. For some reason in my head when I was learning this, I always thought, okay, I sense with my back, or my sense of smell, my sense of touch goes up my back. That made me remember dorsal. So I don't know, that works for me. The ventral root carries neurons that carry information to the muscles and glands. So, depending on which root it is, depends on which direction. You can look at this picture up here. You got dorsal root, that's going to be toward the back of the person, and then you get the front, which is going to be the ventral root. So these two dorsal roots are going to carry sensory information, and this is going to be going from this portion of the spinal nerve. It's going to be going up the spinal cord, whereas the two ventral roots, they're going to be sending electrical information down the spinal cord. And the spinal nerves will have neurons that are going both directions. Remember, because neurons only go in one direction. Their action potentials only go one way. So you got to remember that. So dorsal is sensory, ventral is muscles and glands. And here's another picture of the spinal cord. And I have no idea why I have another picture of it. Just because. Here's a picture of showing you where on the spinal cord, where along the vertebrae, that the spinal nerves coming off the sides, what they innervate. And you can basically see, so you can see that the glands generally match up to where they are. So the spinal nerves reaching the different glands and different organs generally match up with the direction of where they're at. And that kind of makes sense. So the information will go to the area. So that's just kind of the most efficient way of doing it. And then, once the spinal cord ends, you still have some peripheral nerves going down the entire length of the vertebrae. So there is an exception here. So the vagus nerve is one of the cranial nerves. Now, I'm not going to get into the cranial nerves too much. If you go to like medical school for be a physician assistant or a doctor, nurse practitioner, you're going to have to learn a lot more about these. And there's a lot of them, and I don't want to say they're confusing, but, where they go and what they do is something you just have to memorize. That's kind of crazy. But the vagus nerve is kind of interesting because, as you can see, it's a large nerve that goes down right past your trachea and just outside your carotid arteries in your neck. And this is the vagus nerve. When you see someone karate chopping someone in the neck, this is the one that gets affected. This is the one that supposedly, when you hit somebody there and do it the right way, you can kill them. I don't know how true that actually is or how often that can actually happen. But there are some things you can do. You can take someone's, neck and twist it a certain way. One of the things you're damaging is the vagus nerve, because this goes down and innervates half of your heart. It's the parasympathetic portion of your heart innervation, but it also innervates a lot of other organs. So this is the one cranial nerve that doesn't stay in the cranium, so to speak. You can kind of see right here, so we have a major branch. You got one right here too, but this basically still stays in the cranium area. But you have this going down, and it basically it's a major nerve. You can see here all the different things that it innervates. So you got lungs, left and right, your pharynx, your heart, stomach, liver, spleen, pancreas, kidney, small intestine, large intestine, and it handles the parasympathetic, or the relaxation functions. All right. So you need this in tandem with the sympathetic functions that are coming out of your spinal cord, which is shown basically here. You can see heart and lungs. So this is that one exception to that whole thing. But you can see how important it is. It goes to basically all of your major organs. All right, so we're going to end right there. And look for part 2, strictly on the brain, coming up next. Thanks.